As the chairman of the meeting just said, we're living through very difficult times in financial markets. In fact, it's not only the conference that had to change dates and personnel, also investments. In investments, you have to change dates that you invest and destination of investments because markets are so volatile. So what I've decided to talk about is to give an overview of what's happening in Europe, emphasize what solutions there might be to bring some stability in European markets, given the world situation as well. And then there will be time for questions for any more specific questions, to the extent that we know the answers. Is there something wrong with the? Okay. All right. Now, as you know, of course, financial markets have been in turmoil since 2008, and we had big falls in asset prices. Then it looked like the situation was being corrected through some financial reform, but in fact then we got into a debt crisis in Europe, and the two are so closely together that it all looks like one extremely long recession, and that's why it's called the Great Recession in the world economy. Now, although it all looks like one recession, in fact, the corrective measures that we need to take are different, in that the financial crisis was, with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, it was easier to deal with, in that what we mainly needed to ensure there was that there is good bank supervision, that this kind of hidden loans that were given before on the wrong incentives that banks offered are not offered anymore, and in a sense that would have repaired the financial system. And in fact, we made a lot of progress in that direction, with central banks taking on a bigger role in financial control. The debt crisis, however, in many ways it's a lot more difficult to deal with, because it involves the potential of default. And of course, when there's default, then we had one major default, which was Lehman Brothers, and it caused so much turmoil in markets. And in my view, we should do everything we can to avoid any default in European countries. The 50% haircut that Greece has taken, I think, is about the maximum that banks can take. If we have anything similar or even smaller than that coming from other countries, bigger economies, then we are running the risks of major catastrophic events in Europe. So what I'm going to do is to focus on the debt situation, and what I'm going to claim is that recovery in the European economy requires many domestic reforms. By domestic, I mean applying to the whole of Europe, but also to countries in particular. Obviously, if the international economy was growing very fast, especially the United States and China, it would have helped. But they are not growing very fast, and I'm going to bring in the influence that they might have on the European recovery, and I'm going to show that it works both ways as well. That if there is a domestic reform in Europe, and if Europe starts growing, then we would expect to see more growth in China and the United States as well. So I'll begin with survival of the Eurozone and the importance that the Eurozone should survive. Now, you read a lot in the press, at least in Britain, we read a lot in the press, that the Eurozone is no longer viable, and maybe some countries should leave, or even the Financial Times would write articles by saying maybe the Eurozone should either split in two, or maybe Germany should leave and make the euro the currency of Southern Europe. I think that all that talk is both counterproductive, and it will also be very bad for Europe as a whole. Because if you step back from the immediate problems that the Eurozone is facing, and we ask, what is the function of this common currency that's been adopted in Europe, then of course you will see the euro as part of the whole process of European integration. It started with a common market in goods, then it extended to common market in labor and capital. Then we tried to harmonize taxation, institutions, and then as part of that process we introduced monetary union, and that was the most important step following the initial Treaty of Rome in 1958 that brought the economies of Europe together. The Eurozone is not some kind of club of countries that decided to fix their exchange rates, and sometimes you are in, sometimes you are out. It's part of the whole process of European integration, and breaking it up would very seriously introduce obstacles or even conflicts within that process that is bringing the European economies together. If we perceived of the possibility that countries would have left the euro, we wouldn't have left the old dollar-based Bretton Woods system. Maybe we could have switched to using the German mark as the base currency, but we could have kept the system of fixed exchange rates where they could have varied if circumstances required, but not introduce a whole new currency and the currency union. The fact that we made the move in about 10 years ago now, a little bit more than 10 years ago, from a system of fixed but occasionally variable exchange rates to one of the common currency, requires that we should look for solutions within the common currency rather than think of breaking it up as a possibility. And a lot of the volatility that you see in the market is that there are doubts now being raised about the commitment that we have to the Eurozone. Obviously political leaders, especially French and German, are stating very frequently that they are committed to it. But what they're actually doing and what the European Central Bank is doing is not always pointing in the direction of a really complete commitment to make sacrifices to retain the euro in the shape that it has today. Now, in view of what I said then, the entry into the euro is obviously allowed and is encouraged by all new members. All new members of the European Union have to adjust their economies to adapt to the euro and then eventually adopt it, and some of them have already done so. But exit should not be allowed under any circumstances. And talk of Greece leaving now, for example, or any other country would essentially means that it's some kind of failure, and it would destabilize markets even more. Even viewing it from the Greek point of view, although in the very short run Greeks might feel relief that they don't have to follow the austerity measures that were imposed on them, very soon they will realize that they are much worse off outside the euro, because they will also be outside the core of Europe, and Greece has benefited enormously. The economy of Greece has benefited enormously from being part of the euro, and more importantly, they do feel European. They want to be part of Europe, and if they start coming in and out the euro, they will not be respected very much in the wider context of European policy making. Now you might say, and it was said many times, what about countries like Britain and Denmark who stayed outside? Well, Denmark is not quite outside because it follows the euro as much as possible. Britain, though, is outside and is committed to be outside. And since I live in Britain, and now Britain has a government that is not very friendly to Europe by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, the Prime Minister himself said, "Us Eurosceptics," referring to himself and his government. I thought I'd have a short digression in how Europe has responded to this, how Britain has responded to this latest crisis. And it's quite interesting that they claim, and in fact if you see the statement that the Chancellor of the Exchequer made only yesterday. They claim that the reason that the British economy is not recovering so fast now is the crisis in the Eurozone, or rather the reason that the British economy is going backwards. I don't really believe that myself, but there is some importance. It's certainly contributing to falling exports and not helping very much in the recovery. But what's more important is that the British Prime Minister wanted to take an active part recently in finding solutions to the Eurozone problems and solve them quickly. What was even more interesting there is that although they are outside and although they seem to be enjoying their status outside, they never suggested that perhaps some countries would consider leaving the euro and joining Britain into a club of flexible exchange rates. They just said Europe has to find a solution to the Eurozone has to find a solution. They have to deal with the debt problem, and we have to go back to where we were in 2007. And what's also interesting is that reading the newspapers that support the government in Britain, they were rather worried when it seemed that there was a solution to bail out Greece and increase the amount of money that goes into the European Stability Facility, into the European Bailout Fund, in that the British press was saying, oh, the Europeans are moving ahead on their own now and finding solutions, and we're being left behind, and this is bad news for Britain, they said. So there's this kind of contradiction. You know, we want Europe to be together, but on the other hand, we don't want them to be too close together and leave us outside. That's why I feel that even a big country like Britain outside doesn't quite know how to deal with the economic situation from the outside. Imagine smaller countries like Greece or even Italy being outside, how they're going to be. You know, I think it would be bad both for them and for Europe and for financial markets in general. So having said that, we should look for solutions within. So let me now look at some what risks there are from the Eurozone crisis, and then come back to any solutions that I might offer. Now, the reason I think that markets are volatile, financial markets are volatile in Europe, is that it's still not clear what solution is going to be adopted to the debt crisis. And this is really a political failure in Europe, in that we've been talking about it for almost 2 years now. We know what it is. So you might ask, well, why do we not know where we're going? The 50% discount on Greek bonds, what's known as the haircut, it seems to have been absorbed, or it is being absorbed. It removed it, but it removed a lot of liquidity from the financial system. It's doubtful whether banks will be able to pay dividends on their to their investors the next 2 or 3 years. At least those banks that were heavily invested in Greek bonds. I doubt whether any more discount can be absorbed by banks, so it's important to avoid it, I think. But what's even more important is that Greece in particular, but also other countries, need very difficult structural reforms urgently, and the real question is, can they do it? Because if they don't do it, then it is inevitable that there will be other haircuts that will be implemented on debt. Now, what about Italy and Spain? Well, Italy needs to raise a lot of money to pay interest on the debt, and again, how is it going to do that? And if it's going to prosper in the medium run, it still needs to reform its labor market, something that's been going on for a long time. The requirement has been there for a long time, but there is still no progress being made. And also the other issue that I see a lot, at least viewing it from the British point of view in Italy, is that the financial system just doesn't seem to work to generate a lot of activity and efficiency. There's no flexibility either in the labor market or in financial markets, and that needs to work. I don't know how you can achieve that, but that's the perception, that it's not a good investment location because there is no flexibility. You don't know where you stand, the system as a whole just doesn't seem to work very well. Given my specialism in labor market, I can identify very easily where the labor market problems are. It's more difficult to identify where the financial market problems might be. Now, if we look at Spain, the other problem country is that Spain, unlike Italy and Greece, doesn't have a big public debt, but all it has is a very big private debt, and there is always a risk that households will not be able to repay the private debts that they have, which are into financial institutions. Then the financial institutions will be in trouble. They need to be bailed out by their government, and therefore the private debts will transfer into public debts. This is what happened in Ireland, where it was a country of very low debt, and suddenly it became a country of high debt, and is running the same risks as Greece and Italy now. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Spain also needs to reform its labor market very badly. They've been trying, but not succeeding, mainly because of resistance from trade unions. And, of course, the housing market needs to be reformed as well, and I'm going to come back to that. Okay, well, can we trust financial markets then to generate the sort of normal rates of return that we've been seeing before the debt crisis? And I think we cannot trust them before at least two things take place. The first one is that the Eurozone found a solution to systemic fiscal problems. And the second one is that the southern countries embarked on a system of effective reform, especially in their labor markets. And without them, there will always be uncertainties, because the source of the problems that we've been having, if you see both the debt problem and the sort of growth problems that we're having now, you can take them back to problems with the fiscal coordination within the Eurozone. This is my first requirement here. And also the inability of countries to adapt to new circumstances, which you can trace back to the inflexibility of their labor markets. Let's then talk about fiscal coordination and how can we achieve that. Now, the biggest oversight, of course, of the founding fathers of the euro, of the initiators, was that they didn't think there was such a big need of closer fiscal cooperation, as we discovered later that there actually was. They thought they spent a lot of effort into creating a European Central Bank, how the European Central Bank is going to be related to the individual central banks, the whole process of how do you introduce a common currency, but fiscal policy was almost completely ignored. It was just at one meeting in Maastricht they decided to impose those very fluid limits of 3% on deficits and 60% on debt. They don't really have any significance, though they were very quickly broken because everyone knew that they were not very serious limits. And it's fair to say that fiscal policy was generally overlooked, which was a big mistake. You know, whether they knew it was a mistake or whether they thought that fiscal policy didn't matter so much, it doesn't really matter now. But what we know now is that it's impossible to have a monetary union without either a closer coordination of fiscal policies or a potentially large fiscal transfers. Now, we overlooked fiscal cooperation. For 10 years, we didn't have it at all. Countries like Greece tried very hard to control their fiscal policy to get into the euro. By their own admission, they also lied about their fiscal policy at about 1998-99 to get in. But once they got in, they thought, that's it. You know, we made it, we are in, now we can do anything we want. And they deviated in their fiscal policy from that of the core of Europe, of Northern Europe. In fact, I don't know why there is this geographical distinction, but it seems that after the adoption of the euro, Northern Europe embarked on very tight fiscal policy led by Germany, you know, to control inflation, and the southern countries embarked on a very loose fiscal policy, mainly as a reward for those who managed to get their countries into the euro. Now, having done that, having overlooked fiscal cooperation, then the only solution out of it is a fiscal transfer. And unless we have fiscal transfers, we're not going to get out of the crisis. Now, it presumably is understood, and that's why the European Financial Stability Facility was set up. And the balance of the fund was increased from 400 billion to 1 trillion euro. Whether they're going to find the 1 trillion euro to put in the fund is a different matter, but at least the intention is there. But it's obvious now that in future we do need closer fiscal cooperation. We cannot function within the Eurozone without a closer fiscal cooperation. Now, what form does it take? Well, of course, one direction is to have a European Minister of Finance based in Brussels who decides fiscal policy in all the countries, but it seems that all the countries are opposed to that, with the possible exception of some small countries. In fact, only a couple of days ago, I went to a talk by a former Greek Minister of Finance, and he seemed to think that it would be acceptable to the Greeks. In fact, it might be the only solution: control fiscal spending in Greece. But there is such a strong opposition there that I don't think that's feasible to think about that. In my view, however, we could achieve cooperation with creation of a fiscal policy council for Europe, which doesn't have executive powers, but it has advisory powers. Now, such a fiscal policy council exists in Sweden, and it plays a very important role. And only 2 years ago, it was set up in Britain as well. And in fact, the admission by the British finance minister that he's failing in his economic policy that he made yesterday, he only made it because he knew that the Fiscal Policy Council in Britain was going to publish his report saying that if you do correctly the government finances, the British economic policy has been failing to reduce the debt. So he didn't want to go against the Policy Council. It's known as the Office of Budget Responsibility in Britain, because it's supposed to be an independent, objective body, and that's what I'm suggesting, that it would have a very useful role to play in Britain. In Europe. I'm sorry getting my countries wrong, but now what would it be? Well, as I mentioned, it wouldn't have executive powers because they're unacceptable to Europeans, but what it should be doing, it should be checking the fiscal policy of each member of the Eurozone annually, and it should report if it thinks that any member is not reporting correctly their financial statistics. So problems like the ones that we had in countries like Italy and Greece, with the what they used to call creative accounting, would disappear from the system. Then, if a country, if the Fiscal Policy Council discovers that some countries are not reporting correctly what they're doing, or if the policy they're following is going to lead to bigger debts in the future, then it should make that available to the finance ministers, and they can decide what to do about it. They could, for example, as policy action, decide that they shouldn't do anything about it, and then if there are any problems in the future, use fiscal transfers through the bailout fund to help the country in need. Or, more likely, if the Fiscal Policy Council says that there is going to be debt build-up if we adopt the policies that are being proposed, then the ministers could get together and decide whether they want to go down that route or whether not. The most likely is that they will not want to go down that route. There would be threats, and if an individual country decides to go down the route of bigger deficits despite the advice of the Council, then it wouldn't have any reason to expect to be bailed out. It can be left alone to default. Now, of course, for something like this to work, the membership of the Fiscal Policy Council should be completely outside politics. It should be made of technocrats, and that's how it works in Sweden, where it has both permanent and temporary staff who are mostly economists and accountants, and the same holds for the British Council. Now, I don't really see, just to go back to that, we're coming back to the discussion, I don't really see any solution to the problem of bigger fiscal coordination without some institutional reform, institutional change. And what I'm suggesting here that could make to work, I think, is the least important, is the least serious, if you like, institutional change that could be taken on. Now, what about structural reforms? Let's now look at structural reforms. Now, the structural reforms are needed to make the Eurozone behave more like an optimal currency area, something which it was not when the single currency was adopted. Now, in the case of Greece, which is the country that has the most serious structural problems, the reforms are more or less known because they were pointed out by the Troika, the IMF, European Central Bank, and European Commission, that so that indirectly guaranteed its debt. In fact, the view is that not enough reforms have been pointed out. The reforms that were pointed out are the minimum reforms that are needed to take place. They amount to the control of corruption, the modernization of the labor market, and the modernization of the business environment. Greece, in fact, one of the biggest problems, if in the medium to long run, the biggest problem, in fact, I think that it's facing is that it simply doesn't have a business-friendly environment. It's not an environment where an investor will feel happy about putting money in. And therefore, foreign investors have disappeared, and even Greek investors are more or less withdrawing and taking their money abroad to invest. And unless the business environment changes, unless the need to bribe officials to start business changes, there will simply be no investments in that country. There will be no rate of return for any investor to turn to that country. I think it was suggested by the chair in the beginning that I might be able to say, where can one invest to have a rate of return? Well, so far I've only been saying, where should one not invest in the current situation to avoid losses? Now, what about labor markets? Well, again, in Italy, we still need to ensure that the state mechanism is not the disruption that is caused by the state mechanism, which unfortunately is still there according to the OECD. It should be ended, and it also needs to modernize its labor market, remove the very strict controls that there are on employment protection, for example, remove the very strict requirements there are about negotiations with trade unions, that anything you have to do in a big company you have to go through, and generally make the labor market more flexible with less regulation. If you look at the OECD classification of regulation in labor markets, then you'll find that in the order that I put the countries on the slide, those countries, they all need to make their labor markets more flexible, beginning with Spain, followed by Greece, Portugal, France, Belgium, and Italy. All these countries, according to the OECD, have too much inflexibility in labor markets to be able to function as a single economy. And they have different rules as well, so one might sort of contradict the other if they're trying to do any cross-border production, cooperation. That is needed. It's not going to yield immediate results, but it is important if there's going to be growth in the next 5 to 6 years that we do bring the labor markets of the Eurozone countries closer together. Now, what about entrepreneurship? Now, this is the environment for setting up new businesses and operating them, excluding the labor market problems. Now, that has improved a lot in Europe, in fact, and with the Service Directive as well now being discussed in the European Union, it will improve even more. The only exception here again is Greece, where the environment has not been improved yet, but they know that what reforms are needed. And the only thing that I should add here is that maybe a little bit more attention should be paid to unemployment than we do pay now. And a good example to follow is the one of Germany, the recent policy that Germany has been following, which is to link up unemployment with new entrepreneurship, and that is giving subsidies to unemployed workers who are setting up their own businesses. And it's been very successful, in fact. You know, you might think, how could a worker, say, who lost a job in a manufacturing plant be able to set up his own business? Well, in fact, they do, because there is still a process in Europe that we're moving from manufacturing to service production. Service production is dominated by much smaller businesses. And by becoming unemployed in, say, manufacturing, and having the state giving you a subsidy to set up a small company in the service sector, it's a way of encouraging that move towards the service economy. It's been very successful. I think it could and should be tried by more countries. Okay, well, as I said a minute ago, if we do those, if we carry out those reforms, then that would be, those would yield results in the medium run, which I call something like 4 to 5 years. It's important that we do, because the way that the crisis is now, if we leave it alone, we're not going to come out of it in 5 years unless there are serious reforms. Now, what about the very short run, though? You know, what about the period between now and the 5 years that the fiscal coordination issue and the structural reform issue will take place? Now, the one thing actually about the short run is that if we do the structural reforms, you know, especially if countries like Greece and Italy did carry out these structural reforms, at least if they started seriously doing it, then the interest rate on their debt should fall and should make it more sustainable. It's quite amazing that there have been close to 2 years of austerity in Greece, and not a single structural reform has taken place yet of any seriousness. There's been some lip service to some, but no action. And that's one of the reasons that the rating agencies are not changing the rating on the debt, or the interest rate on sovereign debt falling. There should be some reduction in interest rates. But what about stimulating domestic demand? Because we know domestic demand has fallen a lot, and it's not likely to be stimulated for as long as there is uncertainty about the financial sector, so about sovereign risks and about what policies we are going to follow. Now, domestic demand, as it happens now in our countries, is linked very closely to the housing market. It's important to revive the housing market as well to encourage domestic demand. And banks depend on the housing market as well. So one unusual feature of the current recession is the very important position, the very key role played by the housing market. So one way that governments could help in the revival of domestic demand in the short run is to do something about the housing market. You know, offer more incentives for people to take mortgage, maybe remove any taxes they might have on the transfer of housing, which some countries have a lot and which are counterproductive in buying and selling houses. Maybe remove some of the capital gains that people might have to pay when they sell a house. There are many ways that the tax system interferes with the housing market, and removing all those restrictions might revive it, and might in that process revive both domestic demand and also encourage more mobility of people. Now, what about exports? Can we rely on an export-led growth? Well, exports depend on foreign markets, and our biggest, most important foreign markets, if you look at Europe as a whole, is of course either the United States or countries that depend on the United States, and China and the Far East. Now, in the United States, we can't really expect to get any joy out of growth in the United States, because it's held down by a very heavy burden of debt, and there is no solution in sight for that debt. And also both the housing and the labor markets in the United States are still very depressed, and consumer confidence as a result is very low. It so happens that the source of the problem there is also the housing market, but they don't seem to be able to get the housing market to work. See, one feature of the United States economy in past recessions is that it's always been very flexible. The labor market has also responded very flexibly. People moved a lot. They moved from the industrial areas of the north down to the south. Well, now they are not moving. And if you look and ask why are they not moving, the reason is the housing market. One of the implications of the big expansion of home ownership in the last 15 years has been that for people to move now, they have to be able to sell their house quickly. But then the housing market goes into this serious recession. They cannot sell their house, so they just stay where they are and they remain unemployed. It's the first time that we see unemployment persist for so long in the United States. And it's the first time that we see the duration of unemployment being extending so much. And I think of all the reasons that you can attribute that to the increase in home ownership and the depression in the housing market are the two most important. Looking at the implications for Europe, since we don't see any prospect of those markets reviving now, I don't think we can rely on export-driven growth coming from the United States. Now, what about emerging countries? Well, the emerging countries, let's use China as a focus. They could generate, of course, demand for European goods, but they are not likely to do it because they are still suffering from imbalances. They have too high surpluses and not sufficient domestic demand. Their government, especially the Chinese government, is trying to stimulate domestic demand, but the structure of industry is geared to exporting, and it needs to bring about structural changes in the economy if it's going to succeed. And it's not likely to succeed very much. So it's not likely to succeed in generating demand for Western goods. Now, the problem with China is that it still invests too much. It's not inventing too much. It doesn't have much of innovation, but it has a lot of investment. And we know that in those circumstances, the rates of return on investment will fall very rapidly. And the only way to keep economic growth going is something like a reverse process from what we wanted to do in Europe and the United States recently. They need to convert investment into consumption, whereas the problem that we had before the crisis was how to convert consumption into investment goods and grow. In their case, they need to do exactly the opposite. Now, if they did it, their own industry will benefit, of course, but also our industry in Europe will benefit and in the United States. If they fail to do that, which looks like they are failing, that their successes are rather small, if they fail to do it, then rates of return on domestic investment will fall, and their rates of growth as a result will fall as well, and there will be no demand for exports. Because what's the alternative, you might say, if they don't generate domestic demand? The alternative is that they discover more export markets, but where are they going to find them? They're not there. They're just, given the absence of their traditional export markets, which is Europe and the United States, given the depression that you have in those markets, and given their failure to generate more domestic consumption demand, is that I do think there are too many risks if we're going to rely on China. There are both too many risks in their in the return to investment in China, and also too many risks to us in Europe thinking that there is going to be growth outside Europe that is going to increase the demand for our exports. All right. Well, if we cannot rely on foreigners, and if we cannot, and if our own structural reforms will not immediate results, what else can we do? Well, in my view, there is only one thing we can do. We need to generate more demand domestically in Europe. We need to make our goods more competitive. One thing that Britain has benefited, in fact, from in recent years is the depreciation of sterling against the euro. Because in Europe, the European Central Bank has been following such a strict anti-inflation policy. The Bank of England hasn't. Sterling depreciated, and a recent survey of British manufacturers that I saw said that the main benefit, or maybe the only benefit they had in recent months is the fact that their goods are competitive abroad. I said we can't expect an increase in a big increase in export demand from countries like China and the United States, but of course if you depreciate your currency you can take some demand away from your competitors, which is what the British are doing. But the main competitor who is suffering, of course, is Germany, and to a lesser extent Italy and France. Now, and therefore, having reached this point, what can we do? Well, in my view, the only solution in the very short run is that the European Central Bank needs to become more active in financial markets. It should try and bring about more depreciation through monetary easing, known as QE, or essentially printing money to buy bonds. And at one and the same time, by buying the bonds, it helps the countries that have problems in selling their bonds, Italy and Greece in particular. And at the same time, it's putting more liquidity into financial markets in Europe. It's creating more demand. Maybe it's creating more inflation as well, but I don't see any inflation risks in Europe. We could afford to see inflation go up to 4% without any problems. What's the alternative? Well, there is strong opposition, especially from Germany, to more QE by the European Central Bank. Is there anything else we can do? Well, if we won't allow inflation to take place at all, and if we need to make our goods more competitive, then maybe we should relax the other laws that we have on tax competition. Countries like Greece and Italy, for example, maybe should be allowed to subsidize exports. Where do you get the revenue to subsidize the exports? Well, let them tax European imports then. It's a temporary measure. I'm sure it's going to bring shocks to the European Commission when they see this, but if the European Central Bank will not act to bring that about, then let's use fiscal policy as a way of bringing about the same results as depreciation of the euro. I do think, it's obvious if you look at the value of the euro from the point of view of the southern countries that it's just too expensive as a currency. We shouldn't leave it, therefore we should deflate it. What's the impact of doing that? Well, a combination of an import levy and an export subsidy has the same effect as depreciation of the currency, obviously, because it makes imports more expensive and exports cheaper. And the advantage is that it keeps the countries in the euro. It will revive their economy to some extent. It will help them repay foreign debts. It's going against the European Union rules, but exit from the Eurozone or default is much more serious than just having a break on the tax harmonization objectives. It's not as drastic. Now, another policy that might help, fiscal policy, that a country could do on its own, is to switch from payroll taxation to VAT. The reason is that VAT is a tax that applies to imports as well, so you're taxing consumption, and you're taxing consumption of imported goods. And if you use that revenue to subsidize firms to take on workers, to reduce their social security contributions or their either their pension contributions or their national insurance contributions, you will also encourage domestic production at the expense of foreign production. And again, it can help Europe revive some of its revive its balance of payments, at least through reductions on imports and switching to domestic production, which again I think will help a lot and can probably be done within existing European Union rules as well. These are sort of small measures that work on the periphery, if you like, given that the core problem, which is expansion by the European Central Bank, doesn't seem to be forthcoming. So that brings me to the end. I have a lot of concluding remarks, but they all summarize what I said before. There's nothing new here. That what we need to do is to take action on the real economy. I don't need to take over this again. Actually, that we need in the medium to long run, we need the structural reforms and we need fiscal coordination. But in the very short run, we need to be more ruthless and either depreciate the euro, tolerate more inflation within Europe, and then do some fiscal adjustment in taxes to bring about the revival in the European economy. Before then, I'm afraid before any of these things are done, I'm afraid the prospects are not very good. There's just uncertainty and more uncertainty. There is what looked like a safe investment, which is China. I think it's become very unsafe now, because it's still dominated by investment in the same things, and we know from the experience of the Asian crisis in the early 90s that kind of investment brings about very rapid falls in rates of return and potential crash in financial markets, in stock exchanges. The United States doesn't seem to be moving very much because the housing market is holding it back, is holding back its labor market, and Europe, nothing will happen in Europe unless we find a solution to the debt problem, either along the lines I suggested or something more innovative, I expect. Thank you very much.